The acrid scent of smoke and burning wreckage filled the air as David Owens trudged through the barren battlefield, his boots sinking slightly in the dirt beneath him. He could barely see through the haze of smoke that drifted through the desolate landscape. His hand instinctively rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder, though it was the least of his concerns. There were no more enemies here, just the remnants of what had once been a fierce battle. His eyes scanned the wreckage, every step cautious and measured, each breath coming out in a heavy fog as the wind bit at his exposed skin. The mission was over, and yet, it felt like nothing had been accomplished. His comrades, those who had stood by him in the firefight, were either gone or scattered, lost to the chaos. He was alone now. The only sound was the distant hum of an emergency beacon, struggling to stay alive in the silence of the wreckage. And then, he saw her. There, in the distance, barely visible through the dust and smoke, a figure lay sprawled on the ground. A soldier, but not like him. She was alien, a warrior, tall and imposing, her skin a striking green that seemed to shimmer in the dying light. Her body was covered in battle armor, but it was clear from the way she lay that she had been left for dead. David could see the blood, dark and sticky, staining the ground around her. He felt a tug in his chest as he approached, a pull that made no sense. This was the enemy, the other side. And yet, something in him told him to help. Zarare, the warrior's name echoed in his mind, though he had never heard it spoken aloud. The stories about her kind, about the ruthlessness of their people, swirled in his mind. She had been one of the fiercest fighters, a leader in her own right, someone who had terrorized his people in previous battles. She had led her forces against his, with no mercy. And yet here she was, alone, vulnerable, and dying. David's heart beat louder in his ears as he knelt beside her, his mind racing. Should he leave her? She was a threat, after all. But as he looked into her face, her features twisted in pain, her eyes closed in a silent plea for relief, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. She was not just an enemy soldier. She was a living, breathing being in need of help. And if there was one thing David had always prided himself on, it was his ability to never turn his back on someone in need. His hands moved quickly, working to stop the bleeding, to bandage the worst of her wounds. The tech in his pack could help her, if she was still alive when he finished. The battle was over for him. But for Zarare, the war seemed to have just begun. He knew that by helping her, he was crossing a line. But in that moment, with her blood staining his hands and the wind howling around them, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, and a choice that would change everything. David worked tirelessly through the night, using every bit of training and resource he had to keep Zarare alive. Her condition was precarious, the loss of blood almost too much for any being to survive. Yet, with every passing minute, her breathing became a bit more stable, her pulse a little steadier. He didn't know why he was doing this. The enemy, his enemy, had killed countless people. Her people had destroyed families, razed cities, and caused unspeakable horrors. And yet, as David looked at her now, laying on the makeshift bed in the small shelter he had found, something shifted inside him. It was the faintest sense of something more, something human, that wouldn't let him walk away. The cold, harsh world outside seemed to fade as he focused on her wounds. The storm raged on beyond the walls, the wind howling like a distant warning. But here, in this little corner of a destroyed world, there was only the sound of Zurare's shallow breaths and the quiet rhythm of David's own heartbeat. He hadn't expected this. He had expected hatred, anger, and perhaps even fear. But what he felt now, as he carefully adjusted the bandages, was compassion. Compassion for an enemy soldier who, until mere hours ago, had stood as a symbol of everything he fought against. Zarare, stirred in her sleep, a faint groan escaping her lips. David froze, watching her closely. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they locked with his. They were the color of deep, stormy seas, intense and full of questions. The alien warrior didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was enough. It was a mixture of confusion, anger, and something else, something that David couldn't place. She looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. David shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say or do. He had never imagined being in a situation like this. There was no handbook for it, no guide on how to care for the enemy, especially one so different from him. She was a warrior, trained in combat, with a mind as sharp as any blade. And yet, here she was, vulnerable, like a wounded animal, relying on him to save her. "You saved me," Zara whispered hoarsely, her voice deep and raspy, yet full of a surprising vulnerability. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, as if neither of them knew how to react to this unexpected turn of events. David's mind raced, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't done this for gratitude. He hadn't done it for any reward. He had done it because, in that moment, it felt right. But saying that out loud felt impossible. "I did what anyone would have done," David replied, his voice softer than he intended. Zara's lips twitched into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Anyone?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You are a human. You are all the same." The words hit David harder than he expected. They were accusations, but they were laced with something else, something that reminded him of how little he knew about her people, and how much he didn't want to know. He could feel his own heart race, a mix of emotions flooding through him. His instinct was to defend himself, to argue, to explain that not all humans were the same, but something about Zura's tired expression made him pause. He wasn't going to win her over with words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Zara spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "You saved me." "What?" The question hung in the air, and David found himself at a loss for a moment. Why had he saved her? It wasn't for any noble cause, not really. He didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't just that she was injured. It wasn't just because he had no other choice. It was something deeper, something inside him that refused to let her die alone. "Because you deserved a chance," David finally said, the words coming more easily than he expected. Zara blinked at him, her gaze sharp and searching. It felt as though she was trying to read him, to decipher something that was beyond the surface. For a moment, David wondered if she would reject his words, call him weak, or worse, attack him. But instead, she closed her eyes and let out a long breath. "Perhaps you are different," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps not all humans are the same." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an agreement. But it was something, and it was enough for now. David watched her closely, unsure of what would happen next. Zara's breathing slowed, her body still fragile but alive. The storm outside seemed to have calmed, but the storm within him was just beginning. He didn't know what the future held for them, if they would ever be allies, if they would ever truly understand one another. But for now, in this quiet moment, there was one thing David was certain of: the war was not over for either of them. But for a brief second, they had found a common ground. And that was a start. David woke up to the sound of soft, rhythmic breathing. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. His eyes fluttered open, and the faint glow of the small shelter filled his vision. It had been a long night, but Zara was still unconscious, her breathing steady, though shallow. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, and stepped outside for a moment to take in the cold air. The storm had passed, but the horizon was still painted with the aftermath, snow dusted over the barren landscape, a reminder of the fierce weather that had ravaged everything in its path. David's breath hung in the air, his mind replaying the events of the past day. He had never imagined that he would find himself in a situation like this. Caring for an alien warrior, someone who had been the enemy, someone who had been part of the force that had brought so much destruction to his world. And yet here he was, doing everything he could to help her survive. The irony wasn't lost on him. He felt a flicker of guilt. He was alone, far from his unit, in a desolate place, doing what he had never imagined himself doing. Healing someone who should have been his adversary. The thought gnawed at him. But as he turned back to the shelter, the faint sound of Zura's breathing brought him back to reality. He couldn't afford to dwell on his doubts. She needed him. That was all that mattered. Inside, Zara was still unconscious, her body wrapped in blankets, a few makeshift bandages keeping her wounds in check. He moved cautiously towards her, his fingers brushing against her forehead. Her skin was cool to the touch, but the warmth of life still pulsed beneath it. He couldn't help but watch her for a moment, studying her features. Her once fierce expression was now relaxed, vulnerable. The warrior he had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something human. He shook his head. There was no time to waste on thoughts like that. He had to focus. After a quick inspection of her wounds, he began adjusting her bandages, carefully reapplying more pressure to the injured areas. As his hands worked, Zarare stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, a faint groan escaping her lips. Her gaze immediately locked on him, still dazed, but it was clear she remembered who he was. The question in her eyes lingered, but she didn't speak. David paused, allowing her a moment to process the situation. "You're alive," he said softly. His voice was a little hoarse from lack of sleep, but it seemed to reassure her. Her eyes narrowed, studying him as if trying to understand why he was still here, still helping her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was the same question she had asked the day before. David took a breath. He hadn't prepared for this. He had saved her because he couldn't let her die, but now that she was awake, the reasons weren't so clear anymore. It wasn't about revenge, or the survival of his species, or even about right and wrong. It was just instinct. He couldn't explain it. "Because I couldn't leave you," he said simply. Zarare's gaze softened, but only for a moment before the warrior inside her seemed to return. She pulled herself into a sitting position, grimacing in pain. "You should have left me," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "I am your enemy." David frowned, kneeling beside her. "Not anymore." Zarare's eyes searched his face, as if trying to decipher his words. She seemed to be struggling, not just physically, but mentally as well. "I don't understand you," she muttered. Humans are not what I was told." David sighed, leaning back on his heels. "We're not all the same," he said, more to himself than to her. "I've learned that the hard way." The silence between them grew, thick and heavy. Zarare finally let out a slow breath, looking down at her legs, the wounds still fresh and painful. "I was told you would not hesitate to leave me for dead," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That you would show no mercy." David shook his head. "I'm not like them. I never was." Zarare met his gaze again, and this time there was something different in her eyes, something like understanding, but fragile. "Why?" she asked again, though this time, there was no anger in her voice. He looked at her for a long time, unsure of how to answer. He had saved her, yes. But what did that mean? Was it just about saving a life? Or was it something deeper, something he hadn't figured out yet? Before he could respond, Zarare let out a soft grunt, her hand instinctively reaching for the bandages on her leg. David immediately reached for her, gently pushing her hand away. "Don't," he said softly. "You need to rest." She stared at him for a moment before finally nodding, though the frustration was still clear on her face. As she settled back into her makeshift bed, David sat beside her, watching her closely. There was still so much uncertainty between them. They were from different worlds, with different ideologies, different goals. But for now, in this strange, silent moment, they were united by something simple, a shared desire to survive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Days passed in a quiet, uncomfortable silence. The storm had long since blown over, but the world outside remained a barren wasteland, the aftermath of battle still littered across the landscape. David had settled into a routine, checking on Zarare, ensuring her wounds remained bandaged, and working to scavenge whatever he could from the wreckage. Her condition slowly improved, though her spirit was still guarded, her trust in him not easily earned. David had noticed that she was more alert now, her eyes following him with suspicion, but also a quiet curiosity. Zarare was no longer unconscious, but she had not yet fully recovered, either. The mornings were the hardest for her, when the pain from her legs would flare up, and she would stiffen in the bed, trying to hide it. David had seen it enough times to know when to stay back, and when to offer help. One morning, after he had finished his rounds, Zarare spoke. Her voice was still weak, but there was an edge to it, a firmness that surprised him. "I should leave," she said, staring at the makeshift bandages on her legs. David looked at her, surprised. "You can't walk," he said. "You need rest." Zarare looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion on her face. "I am not one to rely on others," she said, her words like a challenge. "I was raised to fight, to never show weakness. But here I am, depending on you for survival." David could hear the bitterness in her voice, but there was also something else, something that hinted at vulnerability. He stepped closer to her, kneeling by her side. "You're not weak," he said, his voice calm. "You're injured." And you're alive. That's all that matters right now. Zara looked away, staring out of the shelter into the vast emptiness beyond. I was not always this vulnerable, she muttered. I was a warrior. I led my people to victory after victory. I was feared across the galaxy. She fell silent for a moment, and David could see the weight of those words in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about physical strength. There was pride there, too. What happened? He asked softly, not wanting to push too hard, but needing to know. Zara's gaze softened, just slightly, and for a brief moment, she let her guard down. My world was destroyed, she said quietly. I fought for my people, my empire, only to watch it all crumble. Now, I am nothing, just a broken warrior. The silence between them hung heavy in the air. David didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if words would make any difference. But he understood the pain of loss. He understood what it felt like to watch everything you believed in fall apart. Zara's words lingered in the space between them, but David didn't let it remain unspoken for long. You're still here, he said quietly. And as long as you're breathing, there's a chance. You're not nothing. Zara met his gaze again, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing his words. The silence stretched between them for a long moment before she finally spoke again, this time softer, almost reluctantly. You do not fear me, she asked. The question surprised him. Why would I? David replied, his brow furrowing. Because I am your enemy, Zara whispered. I killed your people. David shook his head, his expression unwavering. You didn't kill me, he said simply. And I'm not afraid of you. Zara stared at him, the disbelief evident in her eyes. It wasn't anger or hatred that he saw in her gaze now. It was something else, something he couldn't name, but it was there. He wasn't sure if it was relief or something deeper, but whatever it was, it made her voice softer when she spoke again. Why did you save me? She asked, almost as if she were testing him. David hesitated, trying to find the right words. But in the end, he realized there were no easy answers. Because you deserved a chance, he said simply. Zara's eyes narrowed, but there was no hostility in her expression now. There was something else, a quiet acceptance, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Perhaps, we are not so different after all, she said, her voice barely audible. David didn't answer right away, unsure of what to say. But as he looked at her, something shifted in his chest. She wasn't just the enemy anymore. She wasn't just a warrior from a distant world. She was something more. He could feel it, deep inside. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't sure how to navigate. But in that moment, as they sat together, both wounded and vulnerable in their own ways, there was a shared understanding. They were both survivors. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days blended together as David and Zara fell into a quiet, almost routine existence. Outside, the world remained cold and desolate, a vast, empty wilderness of snow and ice. Inside the shelter, however, there was a strange kind of peace. Zara's wounds had healed to the point where she could sit up without wincing, but she still relied on David for support. She was no longer the fearsome warrior who had been ready to strike down any who crossed her path. Now, she was just another survivor, like him. She had begun to speak more, her voice no longer as cold and distant as it had been when she first woke. Her questions were fewer, but they were no less pointed. She still watched David carefully, studying him as if she were trying to figure him out, to understand the strange human who had saved her. David, for his part, had learned more about Zara's people than he ever thought he would. She spoke little of her past, but the bits and pieces she did share painted a picture of a warrior's life, one of constant battle, honor, and duty. The empire she came from was vast and unforgiving, where strength ruled and weakness was punished. It was a harsh existence, one that David couldn't fully comprehend. In a way, it was almost as if Zara had been forged by a world that didn't care about the fragile bonds between individuals. You still don't understand, do you? Zara asked one evening, her voice low but steady. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her legs stretched out in front of her, though she no longer flinched at the sight of the bandages. David had grown used to her presence, to the way her eyes followed him when he moved around the shelter. Understand what? David asked, glancing over his shoulder at her. You act like you know me, she said, her tone still guarded but less hostile than before. Like you understand what I've been through, or why I am the way I am. David paused, considering her words. He had spent the last few days trying to do just that, understand. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't truly grasp the full extent of her experiences. I don't, he admitted, turning to face her. But I'm trying. Zurare's gaze softened slightly, though there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. You think that's enough? She asked quietly. That trying makes a difference. It has to, David said, his voice steady. It's all we have sometimes. The silence that followed hung in the air, heavy and thick. David could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't look away. He could feel her walls, the distance she kept from him, but for the first time, it didn't feel as though it was meant to keep him out. It felt more like a shield she had built to protect herself from something far worse. You're right, Zurare said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. Trying is all we have. David's heart clenched at the quiet vulnerability in her words. For all her strength, all her pride, Zurare was still just a person who had been broken by the very thing she had fought for. I won't leave you, David said, the words firm and resolute. I know you think you're alone in this, but you're not. Zurare's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, she seemed to be considering his words, her eyes searching his face as if weighing him. She didn't speak right away, but David could see the slight shift in her posture. The tension in her shoulders had loosened just a fraction, the wall she had built between them beginning to crumble, even if only a little. Why? Zurare asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. David didn't hesitate. Because I know what it's like to be lost. And right now, we're both lost. Zurare stared at him for a long moment, her eyes studying him closely. She said nothing, but the silence between them wasn't as oppressive as it had been before. It felt different, softer, like two people who had been forced into an unlikely alliance, but who had somehow found something more, a common understanding. For the first time since they had met, Zurare didn't look at him with suspicion or contempt. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a quiet acceptance, perhaps. David felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he had been missing. They were both survivors, yes, but there was something deeper now, a connection that had formed between them, not out of necessity, but out of something more fragile, more human. It was the beginning of trust, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself to believe that it was enough. The days stretched on, and the shelter had become a place of quiet coexistence. The tension that had once defined their relationship was slowly fading, replaced by a subtle understanding. David continued to care for Zurare, making sure her wounds healed properly, while Zurare, in turn, began to help where she could. Her strength was returning, and though she couldn't walk yet, she was no longer the broken, fragile being she had once been. They had settled into a rhythm. David would go out to forage, bringing back what he could find, while Zurare would rest, occasionally offering guidance on how to make better use of their limited supplies. It was a partnership, born out of necessity, but something more was beginning to grow between them. One evening, as David returned from his latest trip into the wasteland, he found Zurare sitting near the fire, her eyes scanning the horizon. She looked different, less guarded, though still carrying the weight of her past. The way she held herself had changed. It was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't the same warrior who had once commanded armies, but she was no longer the wounded animal who had been left for dead. You're getting stronger, David commented as he set down his pack, his voice gentle. Zurare glanced up, a faint glimmer of something in her eyes. Perhaps pride, perhaps something deeper. I can walk again, she said, her tone steady but with a hint of surprise, as if she hadn't quite believed it herself. David smiled, his heart swelling with relief. That's great, he said, his voice warm. It's good to see you moving again. Zurare didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up slowly, testing her legs. The pain was still there, but it was manageable now. She took a cautious step forward, then another. David watched her closely, his gaze filled with admiration for the way she pushed through the discomfort. I never imagined a human would be the one to help me, she said after a long pause, her voice quiet, but filled with something that sounded almost like wonder. I thought you would be like the others. I thought you would leave me to die. David felt his chest tighten at her words. He had saved her not because of some grand idea of heroism, but because he had seen something in her, the same survival instinct that he carried within himself. He had done it because it felt right, because no one deserved to die alone in the cold. "I'm not like the others," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "I don't believe in leaving people behind." Zara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened between them. "You've proven that," she said softly. "And I'm starting to understand that maybe you're right. Maybe not all humans are the same." David felt a flicker of hope in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were still worlds apart. He knew that. They still came from different places, different backgrounds, and their paths had crossed in the most unlikely of circumstances. But in this moment, there was something between them that felt like a bridge, a connection, fragile yet undeniable. As the fire crackled in the background, they both sat in silence, watching the night sky. Zara spoke again after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this war. I never wanted to fight you, to fight anyone. But it was the only way. It was the way of my people." David's gaze softened as he listened to her. It was the first time she had spoken about her past so openly. "I know," he said gently. "War isn't something anyone wants. But sometimes it's thrust upon us." Zara nodded, her gaze lost in the flames. "My people believed in strength above all else," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I was raised to be strong, to lead, to conquer. I never questioned it." She paused for a long time, her voice quiet when she spoke again. "But now, I see that strength isn't just about power. It's about the ability to survive, to endure. And maybe there's more to strength than I ever understood." David watched her, taking in the weight of her words. There was something profound in what she said, a realization that went beyond her role as a warrior. She was changing, evolving, just as he was. And in that change, David found something that made him believe in the possibility of peace, even if it seemed impossible. They sat together in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. There was no need for words now. In that moment, they both understood. The road ahead was uncertain, and the past could not be undone. But together, they had found something new, something that, for the first time, felt like a chance at something better. Days continued to pass, and the bond between David and Zara grew stronger, though neither of them spoke about it directly. The tension that had once filled every moment had eased, replaced with an unspoken understanding. David had become more attuned to Zara's needs, and she, in turn, had begun to show more of her true self, less the warrior and more a person, with fears, doubts, and desires that went beyond battle. They spoke less about the past, focusing instead on the present and what little they could do to survive in this barren world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple, David returned from a scouting trip. The air was cool and crisp, and the quiet hum of the shelter was soothing after the chaos of the outside world. Zara was sitting by the fire, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She had been resting more, her wounds healed enough that she could move around, though she still took things slowly. She looked up as David entered, a faint smile on her face. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. David shook his head, lowering his pack to the ground. "Not much. Just some old supplies, barely enough to last us another week." Zara nodded, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. "We can't keep living like this forever," she said quietly. "We'll need to move soon. There's only so much this place can offer." David sat down beside her, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But for now, we make do with what we have. We're alive, Zara. That's what matters." She didn't reply immediately, but her gaze softened, and she looked at the fire for a long time, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "I never thought I'd be alive again," she said, almost to herself. I thought that once I lost my legs, I would be useless, that I would die alone, forgotten." David turned to her, his expression gentle. "You're not alone," he said softly. "And you're not useless. You've made it this far. That's something." Zara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the truth in his words. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say something more, but instead, she simply nodded, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind stirring the sand outside. As the night grew darker, Zarare spoke again, her voice almost hesitant. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" she asked. "After all this, after the war, after everything that's happened?" David thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know what comes next," he said honestly, "but I know that we're still here. And that means there's still a chance to find something better, something worth fighting for." Zarare's eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty, perhaps, or hope, and she looked away from him, her gaze fixed on the fire once more. "I don't know if I can ever go back to what I was," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the way things were before. I was a warrior, David. I fought for my people, for my empire. But now—" She trailed off, her words hanging in the air. David didn't interrupt her. He simply sat there, listening, understanding the weight of her struggle. "Now you're just someone who's trying to survive," he said quietly. Zarare glanced at him, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, maybe. "Maybe," she said softly. "But that doesn't make it any easier." David nodded. "I get it. It's hard to change. But sometimes, that's all we can do. We take the next step, even when we don't know where it'll lead." Zarare looked at him for a long time, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady but softer than before. "Maybe you're right," she said, her gaze lingering on him for just a moment longer before she looked back at the fire. "Maybe I can try." The silence between them was different now. It wasn't heavy with the weight of the past, nor was it filled with the uncertainty that had plagued their conversations before. There was something new between them, something that felt like a beginning, even if neither of them knew exactly what it was. David glanced at Zarare, a faint sense of hope rising within him. The future was still unclear, but in that moment, it didn't feel as impossible as it once had. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Zarare didn't answer, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips as she gazed at the fire. And for the first time, David felt like he could believe it too. The days passed in a slow, steady rhythm, and though the landscape outside remained unchanged, something inside the shelter had shifted. David and Zarare had grown comfortable with each other, their once tense relationship now a quiet understanding. They no longer spoke as much, their conversations becoming more natural, filled with shared moments rather than awkward attempts at connection. Zarare had regained much of her strength, though her movements were still cautious, still slow. She no longer needed constant care, but David continued to watch over her, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the right thing to do. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Zarare stood by the fire, staring into the flames. David was sitting nearby, cleaning his gear, when he noticed her distant expression. There was something in the way she stood, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, even now, after everything they had been through. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" David asked quietly, his voice soft, but carrying an edge of understanding. Zarare didn't turn to look at him, but her shoulders tensed slightly, as if the question had caught her off guard. "I can't stay here forever," she said after a long pause, her voice quiet, almost distant. "I owe it to myself to move on, to find out what comes next. I've been here long enough." David set his gear aside and stood, walking over to her slowly. "I get it," he said, his tone steady but not without a hint of sadness. "But don't do it because you think you have to. Take your time." Zarare turned her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "Time," she repeated, almost as if the word itself were foreign to her. "I've spent so much of my life rushing from one battle to the next, from one victory to the next. I've never known what it meant to take time, to simply exist." David stepped closer, his gaze steady as he met her eyes. "You don't have to rush anymore. You're not at war now, Zarare. This is different." For a moment, Zarare was silent, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out if he truly understood. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter, almost uncertain. "What if I never find my way back to who I was? What if I can't go back to the warrior I once was?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and full of unspoken fears. David didn't have an answer. He could only offer her what he had, the same thing he had been offering since the beginning: support, understanding, and a willingness to stand by her. "You don't need to go back," he said softly. "You can find a new path, one that's your own." Zarare seemed to consider his words for a moment before slowly turning away from the fire, her gaze softening. "Maybe," she murmured. "Maybe there's more than one way to be strong." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't heavy with the weight of expectation or the tension that had once filled their every interaction. Instead, it was the kind of silence that spoke of two people who had found a moment of understanding, a quiet peace in each other's presence. The next few days were filled with small, quiet steps toward a new beginning. David and Zarare spoke more openly, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. Zarare slowly began to open up more, shedding the armor she had worn for so long, both literal and metaphorical. She still struggled with her identity, still questioned who she was without the title of warrior, but with David's quiet support, she began to accept the possibility that she could be something else, something more. As they sat together one evening, watching the stars appear in the clear night sky, Zarare spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You've shown me a side of humanity I never expected," she said, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "I always thought you were all just fighters. But now, I see there's more to you. More to you than I ever understood." David smiled softly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gentle expression. "We're not so different, Zarare," he said, his voice warm. "I think we're both just trying to figure out what comes next." Zarare nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe we are," she said, quietly, her voice tinged with something like hope. The night stretched on, the stars twinkling above them as they sat in companionable silence, both of them knowing that, no matter what came next, they had found something valuable in each other, a connection, fragile but strong enough to survive the weight of their pasts. And for the first time in a long time, Zarare felt that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand what it meant to truly live. As the weeks went by, the world around them remained the same, desolate, cold, and unyielding. But inside the shelter, things had changed. The tension that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet companionship. David and Zarare had settled into a rhythm that was almost comfortable, though neither of them spoke much about it. There were still moments of silence, of doubt, but they no longer felt like barriers between them. Instead, they felt like pauses, moments to simply exist. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Zarare finally spoke again, her voice softer than usual. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Miss what?" David asked, looking at her curiously. "The fighting. The purpose," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I was always part of something bigger. I knew my place. But now—" She trailed off, her words hanging in the air between them. David looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I miss the purpose too," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "But sometimes it's okay to just live. To just be. You don't always have to have a fight to be worth something." Zarare turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her tone filled with a hint of disbelief. David smiled softly, his eyes meeting hers. "It's not simple," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's still worth it. To have something more than just survival. To have something to hold on to." Zarare stared at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. For a long time, she didn't speak, and David didn't push her. He knew better than to force her to share more than she was ready to. The silence between them stretched on, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was just a moment to be. Eventually, Zarare spoke again, her voice quieter, almost hesitant. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe there is more to life than what I've known." David nodded, his eyes softening as he watched her. "You don't have to have all the answers right away," he said gently. "But it's okay to take your time, to figure things out." Zarare looked at him, and for the first time, there was no wariness in her gaze. No calculation, no armor. Just a person, vulnerable and searching, like him. "You've shown me something, David," she said, her voice steady but full of something new. "You've shown me that there's more to being strong than just fighting." David met her gaze, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close. A connection, a recognition that, despite everything they had been through, they had found something worth holding on to. The fire crackled between them, the warm light casting shadows on their faces as they sat in the quiet of the night. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met, when they had been enemies, strangers, or even just survivors. Now, they were something different, something more. They were two people who had found each other in the aftermath of war, who had learned to trust and care for each other in ways neither of them had expected. And though they didn't know what the future held, they both knew that, for now, it was enough. They had found peace, not in the world around them, but in each other. And for the first time, Zara felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for them, one where they could live without the shadows of the past hanging over them. The fire crackled softly, and as they sat there in the fading light, they both knew that, whatever came next, they were ready to face it together.